The case began in September 2005 when an intense geomagnetic storm rippled across the atmosphere. News outlets reported interference with satellites, aircraft navigation issues, and even sporadic blackouts across parts of the Midwest. Buried among these headlines was a smaller stranger note. A 34-year-old hiker named Daniel Mercer had vanished without a trace in a remote section of the Sawatch Range in Colorado during the same 48-hour window that the storm was at its peak. At the time, authorities treated the disappearance as a tragic but ordinary wilderness incident. 97, an experienced outdoorsman overcome by terrain or weather. What no one realized then was that 18 years later, his case would resurface in the most unsettling way. Mercer 92's last known movements were pieced together from a handful of sources. A ranger at the North Cottonwood trailhead recalled seeing him sign the logbook around noon on the 12th. Weather was calm, skies overcast but stable. The route he indicated led up a little-used trail toward Cronky Lake, an area dense with forest and littered with abandoned mining roads. A pair of hikers later reported seeing him about 4 miles in, walking quickly, head down, as if racing against something. His car remained in the lot, neatly parked, containing a folded map, a nearly full water jug, and a small portable radio. And the search began quietly after he failed to return by the 15th. Local deputies assumed injury or disorientation. Over the next week, more than 60 volunteers, K-9 units, and a helicopter combed the ridges. Nothing surfaced. No pack, no gear, no body. Dogs followed a trail for nearly half a mile before abruptly losing the scent on a flat section of scree, as though Mercer had simply stopped existing past that point. One deputy noted in his log, R93 wind calm. No weather interference. Dogs refused to continue. 94. The entry was underlined but never explained further. Complicating matters was the solar storm. On the very night Mercer went missing, communications in the search zone were plagued by static and malfunctions. Dispatch transcripts show repeated complaints of distorted radio signals. At 21:47 hours on September 12th, a ranger reported hearing what sounded like a human voice cut through the static, repeating, 93 still here, still here. 94. When asked to clarify, the ranger confirmed it had not matched any known unit frequency. The log entry was marked Un-93 equipment anomaly. 94 0. Family interviews later revealed Mercer had been following solar activity closely before his trip. His sister recalled him talking about auroras being visible as far south as Colorado, something he wanted to witness from a high ridge. His personal notebook, found at his apartment, included clipped articles on geomagnetic storms, penciled equations he had copied from scientific journals, and a note scrawled in the margin, 93 watch for the marks. 94. At the time, these details were dismissed as idle curiosity. The official search wound down after 2 weeks. The Sheriff 92's office concluded exposure or a fall had claimed him, the body unrecovered in the difficult terrain. In private, some searchers admitted they were unsettled by the absence of any trace. Usually, even lost hikers leave behind fragments. 7 scraps of clothing, broken branches, food wrappers. But in Mercer 992's case, there was only emptiness. His disappearance blended into the long list of wilderness cases that end without resolution. For nearly 2 decades, the story stayed dormant, kept alive only by online forums and the occasional article linking it to the broader phenomenon of My 93 missing hikers 94 in national forests. But in late 2023, a survey team studying erosion patterns in the Sawatch Range stumbled upon something that changed everything: a scorch mark deep in a gully less than 2 miles from where Mercer was last seen. The mark measured nearly 7 feet across, burned into stone rather than soil, its edges fused as though exposed to extreme heat. Yet there was no sign of fire, no surrounding burn damage, no lightning strikes reported at the time. Forensic geologists dated the discoloration to around 2005. Its chemical structure altered in ways they struggled to explain. The burn resembled neither campfire nor natural strike. It was singular, isolated, and unnervingly precise, and at its center, investigators claimed to find traces of melted metal, consistent with the alloy used in portable radios of the early 2000s. The very type of radio Mercer had been known to carry. This discovery reopened the case, but also locked it in deeper ambiguity. Was it evidence of an accident, an experiment, or something tied to the same storm that had scrambled radios and satellites that week? When pressed, the Park Service released a brief statement. 9283 The Mark is of geological interest, but not linked conclusively to any disappearance. 94. Yet within weeks the file was reclassified and further access restricted. Scientists who examined the site reported feeling pressured to frame their findings as inconclusive. One leaked email between lab technicians read, "Ir 93, this isn't a 92T burn, it 92's imprint," like something pressed into the rock. 94. The message was quietly deleted from public servers days later. With Mercer 92's body still missing and the scorched site sealed off, the case sits at the intersection of wilderness mystery, scientific anomaly, and bureaucratic silence. A man vanished under a sky alive with geomagnetic fire. His last words may have been carried on a broken radio signal. And nearly 2 decades later, the ground itself seems to have kept the only trace of what happened. 97, an impossible burn mark scorched into stone, offering more questions than answers. What really happened out there in 2005? Did Daniel Mercer encounter something unleashed by the storm, or was the storm only a coincidence masking something else entirely? The official record suggests accident. The evidence suggests something different, something never meant to be explained. The first days of the search for Daniel Mercer unfolded with a methodical precision that would later make the absence of results feel even more jarring. Deputies from Chaffee County coordinated with volunteer groups, setting up a command post at the North Cottonwood Trailhead. From there, teams fanned out along ridges and valleys, mapping the terrain in grids. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the slopes with infrared, but each pass yielded only cold silence. Search dogs, brought in from Denver, tracked Mercer 92's scent confidently for a short stretch of trail before halting at the scree field, noses high, agitated, unwilling to continue. Handlers described their behavior as unusual, 97 abrupt stop without sign of confusion, almost as if the trail had been cut. On September 13th, the day after Mercer 92's disappearance, the solar storm intensified. Communications grew unpredictable. Dispatch logs recovered later show entire sentences garbled by static, words bleeding into bursts of noise. At one point, search teams attempting to coordinate their positions reported hearing voices on their channels that did not belong to any unit in the field. One ranger 92's logbook notes, Age 93 heard repeating phrase, 97 bay, 91 still Hera 92 97 not in English accent or familiar tone. Signal cut out after 20 seconds, error 94. The entry was flagged, then dismissed under the category Error 93 radio interference. 94 Zer. Weather remained stable. Clear skies during daylight, cold at night, but within the range an experienced hiker like Mercer would have been prepared for. He had packed layers, a lightweight tent, food for several days, yet none of it was found. Not a wrapper, not a torn scrap of fabric. The lack of material evidence unsettled veteran searchers who understood that even in fatal accidents, belonging surface, a torn strap, a misplaced boot, the scatter of a pack after a fall. Here, the landscape gave nothing back. Family interviews added another layer. Daniel 92's sister recalled him calling days before the trip, speaking with unusual urgency about wanting to 93 see the sky open. 94. He had followed solar storm forecasts, clipping articles about auroras and geomagnetic effects. Friends described him as grounded, rational, not prone to fantasy. He had no history of instability, and yet his journal, found in his apartment, contained passages that seemed obsessive, notes about Laur 93 marks in the stone, 94 sketches of concentric rings, and phrases like, Yar 93, they appear when the sky is charged, 94. Investigators later speculated he may have been following a personal theory, something unscientific, about natural phenomena in the mountains. But even this theory could not explain how he simply vanished in terrain so thoroughly searched. Volunteers reported moments of unease. One recalled hearing what he thought was a child's 92's laughter carried faintly through the trees at dusk, though no children were within miles of the area. Another said he felt as though he was walking in circles despite his compass confirming a straight path. Minor details easily dismissed in the stress of long days and nights, but collectively they seeded the impression that the environment itself was resisting them. By September 18th, the search scaled up. More than 100 people were combing the area. Crews rappelled into narrow gullies, scanned mine shafts, and dragged sections of the river. Still, nothing. The Sheriff 92's office gave its first press briefing, assuring the public that progress was being made, though off-camera, deputies admitted they were running out of options. A local TV station caught footage of auroras flickering faintly on the horizon that night's 97 green ribbons usually unseen so far south. It was the same night a helicopter crew reported a sudden burst of static so violent it forced them to abort a flight. A private note in the ranger log that day reads, In 93 saw a brief flash on ridgeline, white quick like a welding torch, no thunder, no sound after, 94. The entry was not included in official summaries. By the second week, the operation shifted tone. Officials began to speak of Mercer in the past tense. The family resisted, demanding the search continue. Rachel Mercer, his sister, accused authorities of withholding details. She insisted Daniel would never simply disappear, that something had happened connected to the storm. When pressed, she revealed a final voicemail he had left on her phone just before the trip. It's 983. If I don't 982 to come back, look at the stones. Watch the ground. 94 zip. The voicemail was entered into evidence but never released publicly. Those who heard it described the tone as calm, not panicked. 97 like someone recording instructions he expected to matter later. By the third week, official search efforts drew down. The Sheriff 92's office issued a closing statement. In 93, no evidence of foul play. Likely natural causes in difficult terrain. 94. But among the searchers and rangers, silence hung heavier than closure. Radios had carried unexplained voices, compasses spun, dogs stopped short, and a man with gear enough for days had left behind not even a broken strap. What remained was not just a disappearance, but a gap, an absence too complete to explain. For some, it was the mountains swallowing another life. For others, it was the first sign that Mercer's Yak-92's case was different. That whatever happened on the ridgeline during the storm would not be explained by accident, weather, or simple misstep. It was as if he had stepped into a place where ordinary rules did not apply, leaving behind only silence. And the hint of a message in static repeating, "Still here." By late September 2005, the search for Daniel Mercer had officially wound down, but the case never truly settled. The authorities framed it as an unsolved wilderness disappearance, the kind that happens every year in vast, unforgiving terrain. Yet those who had been on the ground knew there was something unusual about this one. The gaps were too wide, the details too discordant, and the storm above had tangled itself into the story in ways that could not be dismissed. In the weeks after the official withdrawal, a handful of volunteers continued to comb the ridges privately. One group mapped their hikes against old mining surveys from the 1920s, convinced Mercer might have stumbled into a forgotten shaft. Their notes describe finding narrow fissures in the limestone cliffs, openings so deep that thrown rocks took several seconds to echo back. They lowered cameras on cords, but captured only static-filled darkness. On one recording, a faint hiss distorted into what sounded almost like syllables, though nothing clear enough to confirm. When they brought this to deputies, the footage was logged and filed away as WAS 93, inconclusive 94. The volunteers were told to stop entering unsafe areas. Meanwhile, dispatch records from the first week of the search circulated quietly among reporters. One transcript from September 14th reads, 93 Unit 7 ear, 97 receiving interference, 85 voice repeating 85, coordinates not matching, 94. The message cuts off. Another entry the same night notes, A93 radio contact lost for 3 minutes, regained with loud burst of static and what sounded like metal scraping. 94. These fragments never made it into the press briefings. Mercer 92's family began pushing for transparency. His sister Rachel filed a public records request for all ranger logs, radio dispatches, and canine reports. When the documents arrived, large sections were redacted, whole pages blanked out with the explanation, 93 technical data not preserved. 94. She described her frustration in interviews. 93, every time we ask for the truth, more pages are missing. 94 days. Attention soon turned to Mercer 92's personal life as investigators tried to fill in the blanks left by the wilderness. Friends described him as an amateur astronomer fascinated by celestial events. He kept notebooks filled with sketches of stars, planetary positions, and notes on geomagnetic activity. One entry in August 2005 mentioned the upcoming solar storm. Yet 93 window opens. Ground may reflect what sky delivers. 94. Cryptic, but consistent with his interest in natural phenomena. Authorities dismissed it as abstract musings. Yet some details in his journals troubled independent researchers. Among the astronomical notes were sketches of rings burned into stone, circles with smaller lines radiating outward. He labeled them Shot 93 imprints. 94. No one knew if he had actually seen such marks or was speculating. But when forensic geologists would later discover a scorch mark in the mountains, the drawings took on a disturbing prescience. Theories began to multiply. Some insisted he had succumbed to hypothermia or an unseen fall. Others believed he had sought something specific during the storm, perhaps an aurora display or some rare geological phenomenon, and had gone too far. Fringe voices suggested abduction, experiments, or encounters with phenomena triggered by the storm. None of these explanations could reconcile all the evidence: the cut-off scent trail, the anomalous radio transmissions, the complete lack of personal belongings. Privately, rangers admitted to unease. One who spoke off record said, "Men 93 and 92 have seen plenty of recoveries. We always find something. Bits of fabric, gear, tracks. With Mercer, it was like the ground swallowed him." 94. Another ranger described how his compass spun erratically one evening near the scree field where the dogs lost the trail. He checked it against a backup, and both needles drifted without settling. The logs he submitted that night were later marked 93 weather interference, or 94 though skies had been clear. Rachel refused to accept the accident explanation. She began working with independent journalists, sharing Mercer 92's notebooks and the voicemail he had left her 1997 or 93, "If I don't 90 come back, look at the stones. Watch the ground." 94. The message circulated quietly online, fueling speculation. What stones had he meant? What did he expect to be found? By the end of 2005, the Mercer disappearance had grown beyond a single-family 92's tragedy. It became a story of contradictions. A man vanishing in calm weather, search dogs halting mid-trail, radios carrying phantom voices, and official records that bled redactions. The wilderness provided no answers, only silence, and the silence itself seemed carefully managed. The solar storm passed, satellites resumed their normal functions, and the world moved on. But in the canyons of the Sawatch Range, the absence remained. A man had walked into the mountains and failed to return, leaving behind no evidence of accident or struggle. Only a trail that ended as if erased, and a series of echoes on the air that no one could explain. The storm had ended in the sky, but for those who searched, it still lingered on the ground. By the spring of 2006, the Mercer disappearance had hardened into two parallel narratives. In the official version, filed away in county records, a hiker was presumed dead, his body unrecovered in the rugged terrain of the Sawatch Range. In the unofficial version, whispered among rangers, journalists, and independent searchers, his case remained an anomaly that refused to fade. The absence of evidence, the timing of the solar storm, and the unsettling fragments in dispatch logs all pointed to something larger than a man lost in the wilderness. Independent searchers returned to the area that April, hoping melting snow might reveal traces. What they found was not Mercer, but a series of peculiar ground disturbances. Near a dry creek bed, several patches of soil appeared unnaturally compressed, as though heavy weight had been applied in perfect circles. No footprints led in or out. Measurements taken showed each circle was nearly identical in diameter, some just under 2 meters. The volunteers photographed the sites, but when these were later provided to park authorities, officials categorized them as USH-93 no-melt depressions. 94, yet locals who had hiked the region for decades said they had never seen anything like them. Around the same time, a short article appeared in a regional paper, noting that during the height of the September 2005 storm, unusual auroras had been observed across Colorado, faint but visible even to the naked eye. Amateur radio operators reported severe interference, describing voices bleeding through frequencies not allocated for voice traffic. One ham operator from Salida recalled picking up what he thought was a distress call on the night Mercer disappeared. The voice, faint and breaking, repeated coordinates that did not match any known trail location. He wrote the sequence in a logbook, but when investigators checked months later, the area was nondescript forest with no sign of human passage. Back in Mercer 92's notebooks, other details surfaced. Among his sketches of constellations and geomagnetic diagrams were pages dedicated to UT-93 imprints, 94. One entry described a HUN-93 stone mark found 1998. 97 resembles heat, but no fire, 94. The location was vague, marked only as HUN-93 Ridge East, 94. His handwriting was precise, his wording careful. It was unclear if this was his own discovery or a detail he had copied from some obscure report. But it suggested he had long been watching for phenomena, similar to the scorch mark found almost 2 decades later. The family, unwilling to let the case go cold, pressed federal agencies for assistance. In response, the FBI briefly opened a file, citing the unexplained circumstances and the possibility of foul play. Their involvement, however, was minimal, limited to reviewing communication logs and interviewing witnesses. Rachel Haylett, 97, still keeping her brother Sin-92's memory alive, Sandeman claimed the agents focused less on Mercer's U-92's habits and more on his journals. Sin-93, they kept asking why he wrote about marks. 94, she later said. After 3 months, the FBI closed their file, stating in 93 no evidence of federal crime. 94. Meanwhile, a series of strange reports trickled in from hikers over the following summer. Several claimed to have seen brief flashes of light on ridge lines, 97 pale, quick bursts like welding arcs, unaccompanied by sound. Others described their compasses swinging erratically in the very area where Mercer 92's scent trail had vanished. One hiker reported his digital camera malfunctioning, the memory card later found corrupted. These accounts never made it into official channels, but local forums began collecting them, building a quiet catalog of anomalies. The most disturbing detail emerged from a volunteer 1982's audio recorder. While documenting his hike near the scree field, he captured faint background noise, a low hum, rising and falling as though mechanical, though no equipment was in the area. At one point, a whisper-like phrase seemed to cut through. 93 still here. 94. Experts who analyzed the file debated whether it was pareidolia 1907 random noise interpreted as words, 1907 or genuine voice interference, but its resemblance to the Ranger Do 92's earlier dispatch log entry was difficult to ignore. As the one-year anniversary approached, the Mercer family held a vigil at the trailhead. Dozens gathered, lighting candles, leaving messages. Rachel read aloud the final voicemail Daniel had left her. Ein die Turi if I don't 92 to come back, look at the stones, watch the ground. 94. His words, once cryptic, now seemed prophetic. Every unexplained circle, every scorched mark, every compass anomaly pointed downward into the earth itself. For the officials, the case remained closed. For the family and the growing circle of those who had walked the terrain, it was not closure, but a widening gap. Daniel Mercer had vanished under a storm-lit sky, leaving behind neither body nor belongings, only fragments that resisted the ordinary categories of accident or misadventure. By late 2006, whispers of a cover-up began to circulate. Why had Ranger logs gone missing? Why were certain dispatch transcripts redacted? Why did agencies push so quickly to declare the case natural despite mounting anomalies? These questions, never answered, became the fuel that kept the story alive long after most wilderness disappearances are forgotten. The storm had passed, but its shadow remained on the ridges, 97 an invisible scar, marked not by fire or weather, but by silence. For many, the Mercer disappearance was no longer about one man lost in the mountains. It was about what the mountains had revealed during those charged hours in September 2005, and why no one wanted to admit what had been seen. By the second anniversary of Daniel Mercer's 92's disappearance, the case had shifted into a strange, unsettled limbo. The official record remained sparse, confined to a few pages of search summaries, weather reports, and a closing statement about Error 93 presumed death by exposure. 94. Yet outside the confines of court filings and ranger briefings, the Mercer file had taken on a life of its own. It was whispered in ranger stations, debated in late-night radio broadcasts, dissected in online forums dedicated to national park disappearances. What made it stand apart was not only the timing with the solar storm, but the way each discovery seemed to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. Unpublished reports from the months following the initial search contained details rarely seen in wilderness cases. In one, a team of geologists contracted to survey landslide risks near the scree field described finding sections of rock that appeared in 93 flash-fused 94 as though exposed to sudden, concentrated heat. Their instruments recorded anomalies in magnetic orientation within the rock samples, inconsistent with known geological processes. The report, filed to the county and later forwarded to the Park Service, was quietly shelved. When journalists requested it under the Freedom of Information Act years later, the reply stated that War 93 no such document exists. 94-4. Search and rescue volunteers also began to speak more openly about their experiences during the operation. One described an evening sweep when his handheld radio emitted a high-pitched tone followed by faint syllables. He was certain it was a human voice, whispering something indistinct. Another recalled that during a sweep along the ridge, all three members of his team experienced their GPS units freezing simultaneously, each device locked at the same incorrect coordinating set in numbers that corresponded not to their location, but to an unmarked point a mile east. When they tried to reach that point the following day, dense fog rolled in, forcing them to abandon the effort. The Family 92's persistence kept the case alive in the public consciousness. Rachel Mercer traveled frequently to Colorado, pressing local officials, organizing private searches, and gathering testimonies. She released pages from Daniel 92's journals, focusing on his repeated references to 193 imprints, 94, and 93 stone marks, 94. One passage dated a month before his disappearance read, 93 storm window approaches, ground should mirror sky, watch for burns, 94. Another, more chilling, simply said, "So 93, if I vanish, follow the marks. 94. These writings were vague enough to resist concrete interpretation, but their alignment with later discoveries, such as the unexplained scorch site found in 2023 day in 97, was impossible to ignore. In 2007, an independent investigator named Michael Larson, a former electrical engineer turned researcher into unexplained wilderness cases, visited the scree field with a small team. They carried magnetometers and EMF sensors. Larson later described the results in a privately published report. Sudden spikes in electromagnetic readings, bursts of static in their recorders, and an unexplained low-frequency hum that persisted for nearly 40 minutes before fading. Most unsettling were the photographs. In several frames taken seconds apart, a pale vertical streak appeared against the ridgeline, almost like a column of light. No one present recalled seeing it with the naked eye. When Larson attempted to share his findings, his credibility was attacked. Local papers dismissed him as a fringe theorist. Officials declined to comment. But the details of his survey matched what earlier searchers had experienced: strange interference, sudden magnetic anomalies, unexplained light. For those paying attention, the pattern was undeniable. The solar storm itself remained a background presence in every retelling of the case. Scientists confirmed that the September 2005 event had been among the most disruptive of the decade, interfering with satellites and power grids worldwide. In Colorado, radio operators logged some of the strongest distortions ever recorded in the state. A retired ham operator from Salida recounted that his rig picked up a repeating phrase during the storm: 93, still here, still here. 94. The coordinates he scribbled down at the time matched almost exactly the area where Mercer had vanished. He shared this detail years later, shaken by the coincidence. By 2008, theories around Mercer C-92's fate had diverged into three broad camps. The first held that he had died in an accident, 97 fallen, into a ravine or shaft, his remains concealed beyond reach. The second suggested foul play, pointing to the erased logs, redacted reports, and missing evidence. The third, the one whispered most quietly, speculated that Mercer had encountered something during the storm that defied explanation, something that left behind fused stone, electromagnetic scars, and voices bleeding through radios. What complicated matters further was the emergence of another detail. In late 2008, a group of hikers stumbled upon a cluster of cairns in the forest, 2 miles from the scree field. The stones had been stacked in spirals, each nearly identical in height, with no sign of natural collapse. At the center of one spiral lay a melted fragment of metal, later identified as aluminum alloy, consistent with consumer electronics. Though never conclusively tied to Mercer's 92's radio, the resemblance was unsettling. The Sheriff 92's office dismissed the cairns as 93 likely created by hikers, 94, but among those who remembered Mercer 92's notes about 93 stone marks, 94, the discovery took on ominous meaning. Psychological impacts began surfacing among those closest to the case. One search volunteer described vivid recurring dreams of walking a straight path that curved into a spiral without his consent. A ranger admitted privately to avoiding the scree field, saying he felt a yen 93 pressures 94 there, like static in the air. Rachel herself spoke of hearing knocks when alone at the trailhead, 3 in sequence, a pattern she later connected with rumors of a second tape allegedly recovered from the cabin years afterward. By the time the case reached its 10th anniversary in 2015, the official silence had become its own statement. Requests for files continued to be denied. Reports of anomalies were left unacknowledged. The burn mark in stone in 97 discovered only years later. 97 was proof that something tangible had occurred in those mountains. But at the time, the absence of official acknowledgement created the impression that Mercer had simply been folded into wilderness statistics. Yet to those who had walked the ground, who had heard the static and felt compasses drift, it was clear his case was different. Daniel Mercer had gone into the mountains during one of the most powerful solar storms in recent memory, leaving behind notes that spoke of marks in the earth. He had left a voicemail urging his sister to Sani to look at the stones. 94. And in the years that followed, what appeared in that terrain 97 burned rock, spirals of stone, melted metal, and seemed to echo his warnings. The fifth stage of the Mercer file was not resolution but deepening uncertainty. Each discovery opened another gap, each silence suggested removal rather than absence. For Rachel, and for those who refused to let the case die, the question was no longer only what had happened to her brother in September 2005. It was what the wilderness itself had recorded in that storm, and why every attempt to reveal it seemed to end in redactions, missing pages, and an official voice repeating the same refrain: "Nothing to see here." Yet the silence, like the burn mark later found in stone, was its own evidence. Something had happened on that ridgeline. Something Daniel Mercer seemed to anticipate. Something that erased his presence but left behind scars in the earth. And until those scars were acknowledged, the case would remain not a disappearance, but a wound. By 2010, the case of Daniel Mercer had already begun its quiet transformation from a Family 92's unresolved tragedy into a subject whispered about in academic corridors, ranger outposts, and late-night conversations on shortwave frequencies. Officially, the disappearance had been closed for nearly 5 years, listed among the hundreds of wilderness cases where terrain and weather make recovery impossible. But the storm that coincided with Mercer 92's last moments and the absence of conventional evidence continued to gnaw at those who had been closest to the search. A private consortium of researchers, loosely affiliated with a university geology department, undertook their own survey of the scree field that spring. Their goal was to confirm or debunk reports of fused rock samples described by earlier surveyors. Over 2 weeks, they mapped the ground in quadrants, extracted cores, and conducted electromagnetic sweeps. The results, never formally published, but circulated through scanned documents, revealed measurable distortions in the local magnetic field. In one quadrant, compasses deviated by up to 20 degrees, even when calibrated against GPS satellites. Cores taken from the fused sections showed layers of quartz that had partially vitrified, as though flash melted at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius. Such heat, the researchers noted, could not be explained by wildfires, lightning, or surface burns. In their notes, one researcher wrote bluntly, "93 local effect, instantaneous, unknown mechanism." 94. While the consortium tried to maintain a clinical tone, fragments of unease crept through their records. One entry described how electronic equipment repeatedly failed in a narrow corridor along the ridgeline. A laptop crashed 3 times during data logging, and an EMF sensor drained 2 full batteries in under 40 minutes. Several members later admitted to feeling persistent headaches while in that zone, which dissipated when they returned to base camp. One described it as us 93 walking through static. 94. Meanwhile, the Mercer Family 92's campaign pressed on. Rachel gave interviews, held vigils, and distributed flyers even years after her brother Sada 92's disappearance. Her insistence on the phrase 93 look at the stones before began to circulate beyond local papers. She was often mocked by officials for clinging to cryptic notes, but her persistence drew attention to the discrepancies in the file. Journalists reviewing radio transcripts found that 3 minutes of search communication on the night of September 13th had been erased. When pressed, the Sheriff 92's office claimed ANINE 93 equipment malfunction. 94, yet the timestamp suggested deliberate removal rather than corruption. By the summer of 2011, new eyewitness accounts surfaced. A pair of climbers, ascending a ridge west of the scree field, reported seeing a pale glow emanating from the valley below just before midnight. They assumed it was a group of campers until they realized no firelight flicker was present. The glow, they said, resembled the aurora but was confined to a circular patch of ground. When they returned 2 days later, no trace remained. Their account was dismissed publicly, but private investigators compared it to the NA93 welding Flash 94 lights earlier reported by searchers. Another layer of unease came from the journals Mercer had left behind. Careful rereading revealed that in the months leading up to his disappearance, he had shifted from astronomical notes to increasingly terrestrial ones. He sketched patterns of spirals, circles of stone, and shapes resembling concentric burns. He referred to these as Herp 93 the mirrors, 94, and noted that Sher 93 charged skies open the ground, 94. The language was ambiguous but consistent. He believed the geomagnetic storm would not only be visible in the sky, but imprinted onto the earth. These journals, long dismissed as eccentric musings, began to seem eerily predictive when scorch marks and fused stone were later uncovered. The psychological impact among rangers also became evident. Several who had been part of the original search transferred away from the district. One admitted privately that he avoided speaking about Mercer because it brings the noise back. 94. Another claimed that while patrolling near the scree in 2009, his radio again picked up faint words through static. 3 syllables, unintelligible but rhythmic. The log entry for that patrol was filed as US-93 interference, 94 echoing the language used 4 years earlier. Into this void of answers stepped independent theorists. Some argued Mercer had fallen victim to natural but misunderstood geomagnetic phenomena, localized ground currents, plasma discharges, or transient luminous events striking the surface. Others leaned toward human explanations, suggesting covert experiments had been conducted under cover of the storm. A smaller but persistent group whispered of more radical interpretations, that Mercer had not simply vanished, but been consumed by an event where natural and unnatural forces blurred. The burn mark discovered in 2023 would later serve as physical validation of many of these theories, but even before its revelation, smaller signs continued to appear. In 2012, a group of hikers posted photographs of new spirals of stones near a clearing 2 miles from the original search zone. The spirals were precise, each nearly identical in size, and arranged with a central depression. At the center of one lay a corroded metallic fragment. Metallurgical analysis indicated it was consistent with alloys used in early 2000s consumer electronics. Though impossible to confirm, many suspected it was a piece of Mercer's 992's portable radio. Officials, however, dismissed the spirals as A's 93 hiker art, 94 or Rachel 92's fight with institutions hardened as each anomaly was ignored or erased. She obtained partial soil analysis reports through leaked contacts showing altered isotopic signatures, but when she tried to present these at a local council meeting, she was cut off. Officials insisted her evidence was inconclusive and urged her to N93 let the matter rest. 94. Instead, she pushed harder, aligning with independent investigators and media outlets willing to cover stories mainstream channels avoided. By the late 2010s, Mercer 92's disappearance was no longer just a family story. It had become part of a pattern. Reports of hikers vanishing during periods of geomagnetic disturbance surfaced from other states, 97 Montana, Arizona, even as far as Maine. Though not identical, the cases carried echoes: sudden loss of scent trails, incomplete radio logs, unexplained light phenomena. None matched Mercer 92's in detail, but his case had become the archetype, the one everyone cited. And through it all, the mountains held their silence. The scree field remained off-trail, unmarked, avoided even by seasoned rangers. The fused stones were buried in technical reports no one acknowledged. The erased radio logs gathered dust, and Rachel continued to repeat her brother 92's final words. 993, if I don't 92 come back, look at the stones, watch the ground, 94. By the time 18 years had passed, those words were no longer only a Sister 92's grief, They had become the central riddle of the Mercer file. The stones had been looked at, the ground had been studied, and what was found defied every ordinary explanation. Yet still, no body, no conclusive answer, only the widening suspicion that Daniel Mercer had encountered something unleashed in the storm, or something the official record could not allow to exist. The sixth stage of the Mercer case was not resolution, but escalation. Each year that passed, the silence of authorities contrasted more sharply with the accumulation of fragments, fused quartz, corrupted logs, spiraled stones, and voices carried on static. The official verdict remained, hiker lost to the wilderness. But those who had seen the evidence firsthand whispered another verdict, one that could never be written down. 7. Daniel Mercer had crossed into something else, and the mountains, in their silence, had borne witness. By the time the case entered its 12th year, the Mercer disappearance had taken on the quality of a shadow archive, existing as much in whispers and withheld fragments as in anything tangible. What had once been a missing persons file in Chaffee County now lived in the uneasy margins of scientific conferences, ranger briefings, and late-night radio discussions. The unanswered questions had only deepened. Why the trail of evidence stopped so abruptly? Why logs had vanished or been censored? Why reports of anomalies never made it beyond private channels? Unofficial investigations carried on. In 2017, a small team of independent geophysicists returned to the Sawatch Range with portable ground-penetrating radar. They intended to scan beneath the scree field where Mercer and 92's scent trail had vanished, hoping to locate voids or collapsed shafts that could explain the absence of remains. What they found instead complicated the mystery. Radar sweeps revealed a pattern of subsurface anomalies, 7 circular zones where the soil reflected signals differently, as if compacted or altered by heat. These zones appeared in a line, evenly spaced, running directly beneath the path Mercer was last believed to have walked. No natural formation matched this arrangement. When the team attempted to publish preliminary findings, the data was challenged as a 93 instrument error. 94. Yet their raw files, circulated privately, told a different story. The earth beneath the scree bore scars no one wished to explain. At the same time, psychological tolls on those linked to the search grew more visible. One volunteer, who had spent weeks combing the ridges back in 2005, described recurring dreams in which he followed Mercer's 92's trail, only to find himself standing before concentric circles burned into rock. Another ranger admitted to bouts of sleep paralysis, each episode accompanied by the sound of faint radio static. In interviews, these men struggled to articulate their fear, yet their accounts shared uncanny overlap 97 spirals, static, absence. Rachel Mercer pressed forward despite mounting exhaustion. She had become the unofficial custodian of the file, amassing copies of ranger logs, fragments of reports, and testimonies ignored by authorities. She also received anonymous envelopes, 97 photocopies of internal memos stamped with classification markings. One memo, though blurred, referenced A-year's 93 acoustic anomalies consistent with voice patterns, 97 non-attributable, day 94. Another stated bluntly, 93 public disclosure would destabilize confidence in wilderness safety. 94. Whether genuine or fabrications, these documents reinforced her conviction that her brother 992's disappearance was more than accident. Other cases began to align with Mercer 92's in unsettling ways. In 2009, a hiker in Arizona disappeared during another geomagnetic storm. His body was never found, but his last journal entry read, 93 hearing knocks. 94. In 2014, 2 climbers in Montana vanished near a ridge during aurora activity. Their abandoned camp contained melted patches in snow with no fire source. Though none were as detailed as Mercer's 92's case, each seemed to echo fragments of his file of 97 interference, anomalies, silence. To Rachel, these were not coincidences, but a widening pattern, evidence of something larger. Back in Colorado, whispers about the scree field persisted. Locals spoke of avoiding the area, of strange sensations when approaching. One hunter described seeing his GPS reset repeatedly, each time to coordinates that led directly toward the site. Another said his dog refused to enter the zone, bristling and whining as though sensing something unseen. These stories circulated quietly, never entering official reports, but they became part of the oral record surrounding the Mercer disappearance. Forensic reanalysis of the original evidence also produced strange results. In 2018, advanced spectrometry was applied to the small samples of fused quartz collected years earlier. The results showed isotopic ratios slightly outside expected ranges, as though the crystals had been subjected to energies not typically encountered in surface conditions. The lab that conducted the analysis received sudden instructions to 93 limit conclusions. 94. The report says 92's final draft simply read, 93 cause undetermined. 94 cell. At this stage, the Mercer disappearance was no longer only about the loss of one man. It had become a convergence point between natural science, suppressed data, and whispered folklore. Every attempt to pin it to accident failed against the mounting weight of anomalies. Every effort to close the file seemed met by new details slipping into circulation. Spirals, burns, distorted voices. The deeper question began to emerge. Was Mercer 92's disappearance the result of a singular, unrepeatable event tied to the 2005 storm, or was it part of a recurring pattern that authorities had quietly tracked for decades? The silence from official channels suggested the latter. Rachel herself once remarked, 93, if this was just about my brother, their 92'd let me have the file. It's 92's not just about him. It's 92's about what else they know. 94. By year 12, the case no longer felt like a wilderness mystery, but like the edges of a larger map, Bristol 97-1, where storms, ground, and vanished people marked coordinates that no one wanted to connect publicly. Daniel Mercer remained missing, but the evidence suggested he had walked into more than a mountain storm. He had stepped into the intersection of earth and sky, leaving behind a trail erased yet scarred into stone, a reminder that his absence was not empty but charged, humming, unresolved. By 2019, the Mercer case had hardened into folklore and yet paradoxically grown sharper in its anomalies. Journalists who revisited the file discovered layers of inconsistency that had been overlooked a decade earlier. One reporter noted that the official incident map, provided to the public during the first search, did not match the coordinates listed in Ranger Patrol logs. Entire swaths of ground near the scree field 97 precisely where dogs had lost the scent 97 were omitted. When asked why, the Sheriff 92's office cited 193 cartographic error, 94, but cartographers later confirmed the omission was deliberate, not accidental. That same year, a controlled burn in a valley near the original search zone uncovered a new anomaly. Fire crews reported finding a circular patch of ground that resisted ignition. Grass and brush burned right up to the boundary, but would not catch within the ring. Soil samples sent for analysis showed high concentrations of silicate fused together as though exposed to extreme heat years earlier. Quietly, a ranger noted the date on his clipboard, September 2005. No official report connected the anomaly to Mercer, yet within weeks the samples were transferred to a federal lab in Denver. When the local crew requested results, they were told the data was 93 not for release. 94-0. Whispers of cover-up grew louder. One leak, traced to a technician in a regional laboratory, suggested that the scorch mark discovered in 2023 was not the first of its kind but merely the first acknowledged. Since 1983, there are others. Defies 4, the technician said in a message passed anonymously to journalists. At 93, smaller, hidden, ignored. They don't 92 want a pattern. 94 saw. Rachel, unrelenting, pursued these leads. She held a press conference in Salida, showing side-by-side images, Daniel 92's sketches of concentric stone rings from his journal, the cairns discovered in 2008, and now the burn-resistant circle from the fire zone. So 93, my brother told us to look at the stones. 94, she said. 93. This is what he meant. They're 92 are everywhere, if you know where to look. 94. Officials dismissed her presentation as grief-fueled speculation, yet the images circulated widely online, cementing Mercer 92's case in the growing catalog of Mon 93 unexplained wilderness events. 94-4. Meanwhile, fragments of audio evidence resurfaced. A retired dispatcher shared an old reel-to-reel tape labeled Rs 93 Sep 12 Air 9614, 2005 97 interference, or 94. The tape contained hours of static from ranger channels, most of it unremarkable. But at 2:11 a.m. on the 13th, a faint human voice broke through, repeating a phrase several times, when 93, still here, watch the ground. 94. Audio engineers debated whether it was pareidolia, a human tendency to hear words and noise, or a genuine transmission. Either way, the tape reignited speculation. Combined with the voicemail Mercer had left his sister, the words seemed to echo across time. Independent investigators built timelines that layered solar activity with disappearances. They found that in the last 2 decades, at least 9 hikers across the United States had vanished during or shortly after periods of geomagnetic disturbance. The Mercer case fit too neatly into the pattern. Most authorities waved this aside as coincidence, but the clustering of events gave fuel to theories that something about storms altered more than just the sky. Psychological strain grew among those who had once searched for Mercer. A ranger who had been part of the helicopter crew admitted to seeing a flash of light in the valley during the storm, a detail he had omitted in his official report. 93 it wasn't, 92T lightning, 94, he said. 93 it was below us, not above. 94. Another searcher described vivid memories of feeling pressure in his ears, like altitude sickness, though they had not climbed higher than base camp. Both men confessed these details years later, long after they had retired. By late 2019, the Mercer disappearance had shifted into something broader, not just a missing man, but a symbol of how natural and official silence can intertwine. Each anomaly, 97 the fused quartz, the spirals, the scorched stone, the radio voices, was a fragment. Taken together, they suggested an event that did not fit within accident, crime, or weather. Yet every attempt to assemble those fragments into a coherent picture met resistance, redaction, or denial. The 8th stage of the Mercer case was marked by a growing recognition. His disappearance was not a closed chapter, but an open wound. For those who still searched, the question had expanded beyond one man. If the storm had left scars in stone, if voices had carried through static, if coordinates had been erased from maps, 97, then Mercer 92's vanishing was not isolated. It was a signal, and the ground beneath the Sawatch Range still carried its echo. By 2021, the Mercer file had outlived most wilderness disappearances by sheer force of persistence. Normally, cases like his fall silent after a few years. T7 families forced to accept absence, officials content with a line in a ledger, the public distracted by the next story. But Mercer 92's case refused to recede. The details were too sharp, the absences too deliberate, and the evidence too strange. With the burn mark discovery still 2 years in the future, the story was already becoming less about a lost hiker and more about the uneasy boundary between official narratives and what lay beneath them. That year, a leaked National Park Service memorandum surfaced online. Marked HFL1I Berstroke Siu for internal use, only Airfel War 0 Erstroke Siu. It summarized a series of Eden 93 anomalous ground disturbances, 94, cataloged across 4 states since the late 1990s. The report listed circular zones of fused soil, URN-93 magnetic irregularities, 94, and repeated witness descriptions of light phenomena during geomagnetic storms. The Mercer site was not named directly, but one entry from 2005 described her 93 search interference coinciding with geomagnetic storm. Subject not recovered. 94. The memo was quickly removed from the website where it appeared, but copies had already spread across forums. For Rachel, it was the closest thing to proof she had been chasing for more than 15 years. In 93, they knew this wasn't 92T, just Daniel. 94, she told a small gathering outside the courthouse in Buena Vista. In 93, their 92 have been tracking this for decades. 94's Zekuan family involvement had long since moved past grief into active investigation. Rachel coordinated with independent researchers, many of them amateurs but diligent in their methods. They cross-referenced weather archives with missing persons cases, drawing up charts that showed clear clustering of disappearances during storm activity. They shared these with sympathetic scientists, some of whom admitted privately that the correlations were difficult to dismiss. Publicly, however, few were willing to stake their reputations on such controversial ground. Meanwhile, in the Sawatch Range itself, the land kept yielding fragments. In the summer of 2021, a fire mitigation crew clearing brush on a ridge 2 miles east of the scree field reported stumbling upon a strange arrangement of stones. Unlike the earlier spirals, these were aligned in straight lines radiating outward from a central depression. Beneath one of the stones, partially buried, they found a rusted metal object the size of a coin. Lab analysis determined it was a melted button, consistent with outdoor gear from the early 2000s. The discovery was not announced publicly. Instead, it was passed quietly to county officials. Within weeks, the stones had been dismantled, the site reseeded with brush. When independent investigators tried to visit, they found nothing but disturbed soil. This pattern of discovery, followed by removal, fed suspicions of a cover-up. Documents obtained through FOIA requests were heavily redacted. Radio logs contained unexplained gaps. Soil reports were filed under 193 archival classification, 94 a phrase with no clear definition. Each time Rachel or her allies pressed, they encountered silence or dismissal. One official told her flatly, 93 92er chasing shadows, 94. But in the Mercer case, shadows were the evidence, the static bursts, the fused stones, the erased maps. Psychological effects continued to ripple outward. Several searchers from 2005 reported long-term anxiety. One described recurring auditory hallucinations, bursts of static, followed by faint words. Another admitted to developing an aversion to radios, convinced they carried echoes of that night. A third man, who had since moved out of state, told Rachel during a phone call that he sometimes dreamed of standing on the scree field, watching the ground ripple as if it were water. These testimonies, while unverifiable, formed a troubling pattern. Those closest to the search carried fragments of the anomaly with them. In late 2021, a strange break occurred. A geophysicist named Alan Whitaker, who had worked on the 2006 survey of the scree field, gave an interview to a regional science journal. In it, he admitted that his team in 92's instruments had detected not only fused quartz, but also 93 localized residual magnetism inconsistent with natural polarity. 94. When pressed, he described the phenomenon as seeing D3 a magnetic scar. 94, something left behind by an intense but fleeting force. The interview was online for only 48 hours before it was removed, the journal citing 183 editorial inaccuracies at 94. Whitaker did not comment again. Parallel to the science were the legends. Locals began weaving Mercer's 92's name into older folklore of the region. 97 tales of 93 lights on the ridges, 94 stories told by miners in the early 20th century of voices carried on the wind during storms. Old surveyor journals, unearthed from archives, mentioned compasses spinning wildly in certain valleys, decades before Mercer vanished. These stories had always been dismissed as exaggerations. Now, in light of his disappearance, they were recast as precursors. The past was beginning to rhyme with the present. The Family 92's struggle reached another peak in 2022, when Rachel filed a lawsuit demanding the release of all Ranger logs from the 2005 search. The court denied her request, citing Darwar's 93 national security exemptions. 94. It was a phrase no one expected in relation to a missing hiker. Outside the courthouse, Rachel told reporters, "If this was just my brother lost in the mountains, there would be nothing to hide. The fact that they're 92 are hiding it tells you everything." 94 for. That same year, another disturbing piece surfaced. A former Forest Service employee, speaking anonymously, claimed that shortly after Mercer vanished, an unmarked team arrived on site. They were not in Ranger uniforms, but carried equipment described as US-93 portable EM monitors. 94. They spent 2 nights near the scree field, then departed without briefing local staff. The whistleblower admitted he could never prove their identity, but his account matched what others had hinted, that Mercer 92's case drew attention from agencies far beyond county jurisdiction. By the time the burn mark was discovered in 2023, the Mercer case had become both more specific and more unresolvable. The scorch fused into stone was undeniable, physical, measurable, but instead of answering questions, it reinforced Mercer 92's final message. 93 watched the ground. 94. His absence was not just a void, but a mark, pressed into earth by forces unacknowledged. The 9th stage of the Mercer case was aftermath in the truest sense. 18 years after his disappearance, the file remained unresolved. The family still fought, the officials still denied, and the wilderness still whispered with static and silence. What lingered was not closure but corrosion, the erosion of trust between public and institution, between explanation and evidence. The Sawatch Range had swallowed one man during a storm, leaving behind not bones but anomalies. The scorched stone, erased maps, magnetic scars, voices caught on tape. Each fragment stood as evidence, yet none formed a conclusion. And in that gap, suspicion grew. Was Mercer the victim of wilderness, or witness to something hidden in plain sight? The aftermath was less an ending than a widening. Each new anomaly suggested Mercer 92's case was not unique, but part of a pattern stretching back decades. And as the burn mark glowed faintly in the memory of those who had seen it, the question grew sharper, heavier, unshakable. What really happened out there in September 2005, under a storm-lit sky? And why, 18 years later, did the Earth itself still seem to remember what the official record refused to say? By the time nearly 2 decades had passed, the disappearance of Daniel Mercer no longer resembled an isolated tragedy, but a case study in how silence can be louder than evidence. Officially, the record remained unchanged. One man lost to the wilderness in September 2005, presumed dead. Yet outside the paperwork, the fragments had grown into a narrative that felt more like a suppressed dossier than a missing person file. What lingered was not just the absence of Mercer himself, but the presence of everything left unexplained. Radio bursts, fused stone, erased maps, and the voicemail that had warned, "Aaron 93 watched the ground." 94. In the years following the discovery of the 2023 burn mark, scientists, journalists, and locals debated what it represented. Some insisted it was the result of a lightning strike or geological quirk, though the measurements pointed to temperatures no surface storm could account for. Others suggested it was human in origin 97 equipment, experiments, testing under cover of a natural solar event. Theories multiplied, but none fit all the facts. The Mark 92's geometry was too precise, its magnetic trace too anomalous. When combined with Mercer 92's notebooks, which had sketched similar patterns years earlier, the coincidence grew impossible to ignore. The Mercer case became a prism through which larger questions were refracted. How many wilderness disappearances had been quietly dismissed despite anomalies? How many ranger logs contained redactions that had nothing to do with privacy and everything to do with control? Independent researchers mapped other cases against geomagnetic storms and found disturbing overlaps. In some, the links were tenuous. In others, unmistakable. The pattern was not proof, but it was enough to shift the case from tragedy into Category 97A category of vanishing linked to skies, storms, and scars on the earth. Psychological weight fell hardest on those closest to the file. Rachel Mercer, who had spent almost 2 decades fighting institutions, spoke less of grief and more of patterns. In interviews, she would hold up Daniel 992's journals beside photographs of scorch marks or stone spirals found by hikers. She 93 these aren't 1992T drawings of fantasy, 94 she said once. 983 they're 982 records. He saw it before it happened, 94. Former searchers, now older, admitted quietly that they avoided even speaking Mercer 92's name. To do so, they said, was to invite back the static, the unease. Several described still hearing knocks at night, faint and rhythmic, as if echoes of that storm followed them home. The wilderness itself became a character in the story, not merely backdrop, but participant. Hikers reported that compasses continued to spin near the scree field. Cameras malfunctioned in odd ways, producing streaks of light not seen with the naked eye. Rangers admitted privately that wildlife avoided the zone. Whether natural coincidence or not, the impression remained. The land remembered. As the 18th anniversary passed, the Mercer case was less about searching for remains than about confronting what the official narrative excluded. The silence of agencies, the redacted files, the vanished memos, 97. All these were evidence in their own way. They suggested knowledge withheld, not ignorance. And with each year, the refusal to release data grew heavier than the data itself. The legacy of the Mercer disappearance is twofold. For one, it stands as testimony to the limits of official explanations when fragments persist that do not align. For another, it has become part of a growing folklore of storms and vanishings, where earth and sky intersect and leave behind marks no one wants to name. The burn scars, the spirals, the erased coordinates. 7. These are not conclusions, but reminders that the story resists ending. When people gather now at the trailhead to mark the anniversary, they speak less of closure and more of vigilance. Rachel still repeats her brother 92's last message. A 93 if I don't 92T come back, look at the stones. 94. And each time another hiker vanishes during a storm, each time another scorch pattern is found in soil or stone, Mercer 92's warning grows sharper. What happened in September 2005 remains unresolved. Perhaps Mercer succumbed to the wilderness. Perhaps he witnessed something unleashed in the collision of storm and ground. Perhaps the truth lies in pages still redacted and files still sealed. The evidence resists arrangement into a single narrative. And so the case endures, unresolved yet persistent, like the static that bled through radios that night. It leaves us with the same question Rachel has asked for 18 years, the one no official file can answer. What really happened out there under a storm-lit sky, and why does the ground itself still seem to remember